Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I'm your host, Zach Bitter, and today I have a guest interview on tap for all of you. Today's guest is Alan Aragon. Alan was a guest I have been excited to have on for a while. He's got quite a resume. Alan is a nutrition researcher and educator with over 25 years of success in the field. He is known as one of the most influential figures in the fitness industry's movement towards evidence-based information. His notable clients include Stone Cold Steve Austin, Derek Fisher, Pete Sampras, and the list goes on. So Alan writes a monthly research review, AARR, providing cutting-edge theoretical and practical information. Alan's work has been published in popular magazines as well as peer-reviewed scientific literature. One of the reasons I wanted to chat with Alan is he just had a new book come out that is called Flexible Dieting. And with that approach, I really like the way that he kind of includes everyone, I guess is maybe the way to say it. When I think of things like the dietary guidelines or, even a specific way of eating that whomever believes is the best way, it sort of ignores the entire idea that individuals have different preferences, and those preferences may or may not make a specific dietary trend or way of eating sustainable for them long term. So I think that's why a lot of times we see people take on a very specific way of eating and do well at first, but gradually maybe slip away from it as it was sustainable for them in the short term, but not necessarily the long term. So Alan is one of the guys who's out there trying to find some templates that are going to help people both get what they need, but also meet their individual needs. And that's kind of the overarching theme with flexible dieting. A big component of that is kind of starting with protein, and then with the fat and carbohydrate side of things, that's where you can kind of personalize a bit. If you're someone who really prefers more like fatty, rich foods or is trying to reduce carbohydrates for whatever reason, there's room for it within his approach. And kind of same with the other side of the spectrum. If you're targeting high amounts of carbohydrate and you want to fill the void in with more of that, you can do it with his approach as well. So I wanted to talk to Alan a little bit about kind of like the idea behind it, some of the misrepresentation we see on there about it, and ultimately how you can, like with any dietary approach, screw it up. So had a fun chat with Alan. I think you'll like this one, and hopefully we'll have him back on down the road with some other topics. He's considered one of the experts when it comes to protein research and things like that. So it was awesome to have some of his time. If you're interested in checking out this interview or any interview ad-free and early release, you can do that on the show's Patreon page. Right now, sitting on the show's Patreon page is, of course, this interview with Alan, but also my interview with Dr. Taylor Sittler, where I took another swing at chatting about continuous glucose monitors. I have one up on continuous glucose monitors already with Kara Collier. So with Dr. Sittler, I try to kind of go about it with a few different questions or some different angles so that we fill in some of the stuff that maybe we didn't chat with Kara. On that note, not on the Patreon page yet and not yet recorded, I'll also be having Doctors Spencer and Carl Nadolski come on to share their take on this. I think they'll have some pessimistic views, I think, with it that I think will be good to share, because like with any tool, it can be abused. And I want to hear kind of what they're seeing as potential side effects or downfalls of having essentially more information available or more timely information available with blood glucose and things like that. I know they'll also have some positives to talk about it, but they'll help kind of go full circle with that conversation on continuous glucose monitoring. And if there's reason to talk about it more after that one, then maybe we'll have another guest on to fill in whatever gaps come up next. So like with any of the show's topics and interests, feel free to reach out to me with questions, curiosities, or deeper dives on specific aspects, and I will try to find someone who will want to kind of address those specific things or is capable of doing that. So don't be bashful on that side. Also on the show Patreon page is my interview with Vinnie Crispino. And Vinnie is very interesting. We spoke quite a bit about his background, which was a highly competitive Division I swimmer. And after kind of getting a little burnt out with that, he headed west to try to take up surfing, ended up breaking his back up against a rock, and spent about 10 years kind of finding a solution that didn't involve him fusing discs. So very interesting chat with him. And I think one of the common connection points we had too is he's currently training for a 50-mile race. So if that tells you a little bit about how his progression from breaking his back on a rock has gone, it will highlight that. He's also the founder of a company called the Pain Academy. So I think we'll actually probably do a follow-up interview with him, because he's going to show me some movements that he thinks are going to be very valuable in terms of making running a little more sustainable and possibly pain-free for those of you who are out there struggling with running because something is bothering you or some form of pain is keeping you from enjoying that sport the way you would like to. So those are up on the show Patreon page. You can access them by heading to my website at zachbitter.com/HPO. And that page has all the links to the show Patreon page, as well as links to all the episodes with the details, the notes, the links, and everything like that. So that's kind of like the main landing page. From there, you can also contribute with one-time donations if you want to, or check out some of the links and discounts offered by the podcast show sponsors. Also, if you happen to be in Austin, Texas, or visiting Austin, Texas on a weekend, I am hosting a group run on Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. All people are welcome. You can come and walk. You can come and run. You can bring the whole family, the stroller, the dog, anything you want. We have a fun group. I think we had about 40 people out there the last couple Sundays, and we'd love to have you out there. Right now, we have a 2.5 mile run walk option, a roughly 4.5 mile run loop, and then a 6 mile run loop that we have. And we're looking to possibly add more to that down the road as it grows. Or also add maybe an early bird start, since 8 a.m. is a little bit later for sometimes on the Sunday morning group run meetups. But if you want to join that or check it out, whether it to be coming all the time on Sunday mornings or just one time to see what it's like when you're visiting or something like that, that's 8 a.m. Right now we're meeting at Metz Park, but the specific details are best accessed at the Instagram page, which is at OutliersATX. All right. That is all I have for the announcements, other than this episode's show sponsors include LMNT and Optimal Carnivore. Element makes an electrolyte supplement with no sugar. Each packet is loaded with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. They come in convenient single-serve packets that make them great for bringing along for a run, hike, going to the gym, or while traveling. My go-tos are the citrus flavor and the newly restocked watermelon flavor for my long runs and post-run rehydration, as well as their chocolate flavor, which I love to add in my morning coffee with a little bit of creamer. Tastes great, and it's a fun way to start the day for me. If you are hesitant or would like to try out Element first, before you purchase, they are offering a flavor sample pack with one of each of their flavors for free to anyone who uses the HPO URL. If you want to check them out and support HPO along the way, you can head over to drinklmnt.com/HPO. That's drinklmnt.com/HPO. Links can be found in the show notes, as well as at zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. Also supporting this episode are my friends at Optimal Carnivore. Organ meats are some of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. Despite their benefits, sometimes it can be difficult to incorporate them into your diet. Optimal Carnivore aims at making these nutrients easier to access with their products, which include grass-fed organ complex, bone marrow complex, and grass-fed beef liver. These products work great for busy people who are traveling or as they develop an appreciation for organ meats. Their grass-fed organ complex has 9 different organs, including beef liver, brain, thymus, heart, kidney, spleen, pancreas, lung, and gallbladder. Bone marrow complex contains the same components as bone broth. Their products are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished and free of hormones, pesticides, antibiotics, and GMOs. They also plant one tree for every product sold. If interested, you can visit amazon.com/optimal carnivore and use the code HUMANSAVE10, that's HUMANSAVE10, for 10% off your next order. As always, all HPO sponsors, links, discounts can be found by visiting the show sponsor page at zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. Alan Aragon, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Zach. It is a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you are at the moment going around talking a bit about your book that has to do with flexible dieting. And I find that topic really interesting because when I kind of first started engaging with podcasts, I guess you could say, like back in the early 2010s, there was this like kind of phenomenon that kind of was popping up in a lot of the nutrition talk of like if it fits your macro. And I'm sure you remember this. And it was like, it kind of was this thing where I think the intent was probably good with whoever came up with that originally. But then like oftentimes happens on the internet, you get everyone trying to do everything they can with it. And before you know it, you're in a situation where it's not the same thing it was originally intended to be. Mm-hmm. And you sort of have to either rebrand it or reposition it in a way that actually kind of like doesn't have all that baggage that came along with the mistakes in the beginning and things like that. Was that what kind of first tipped you off to like a flexible diet type of approach, or what was the kind of the genesis, I guess I should say?
Yeah, it really was just banter on the bodybuilding forums where kids just basically wanted to get in shape and look better than average in terms of body composition, muscle gain, fat loss and stuff. And there's a lot of recreational bodybuilders, physique culture type folks, the occasional competitor. And the lore at the time was it was all about the foods you chose in order to achieve a certain look. It was all about a very narrow set of stereotypically authorized foods that would enable you to look like the guys on the cover of the magazines. And so people were just very curious and very confused about what are these foods and stuff. And just constant questions would get asked about whether, okay, do I need to eat chicken breast? But I like the dark meat. Is it okay if I have dark poultry? Is that all right? And then the answer would be, well, that meat has a higher fat content. And so as long as you account for the fact that there's more fat coming in there per serving, then yeah, go ahead and have that food. It doesn't always have to be chicken breast. And similar questions would just pop up constantly, like, can I have whole eggs instead of just the egg whites? Can I still be cutting on that? Can I still achieve the physique I want on whole eggs? And then of course the answer would be, well, got to take into account the macronutrition of egg whites versus whole eggs. Whole eggs have about 5 grams of fat per egg. You just account for that and you're good. And so it would just literally go on and on all day long. Can I have cheese during a cut? Can I have peanut butter during a cut? And just any food you can think about, even different kinds of fruits. And of course, the answer would be, all right, do you have any idea what your macronutrient targets are that would comprise your diet? How does this food fit into that scheme? If that food fits your macronutrient targets, then it's fine. Go ahead and have that food. And so what that bit of advice turned into, we turned it into an acronym. If it fits your macros, instead of having to say, if it fits your macronutrient targets, then go ahead and have that food. Like instead of writing that out every time for the newbies who post questions on the message boards, like dozens of times a day, we just literally wrote the acronym IIFYM. Look it up. IIFYM. And it became this cheeky, sort of snarky, smart-ass answer just because people just had no concept of macronutrition and how different foods have different macronutrient breakdowns and how does that actually fit into a plan. And so what happened from that point was something that was unintended, which was people took the IIFYM acronym and turned it into a type of a diet. And not only just turning it into a diet, which was not the intention, they turned it into a junk food diet. So people would basically gloat over how they hit their macronutrient targets for protein, carbs, and fat, but they hit it with just a bunch of crap foods, like a bunch of desserts and maybe throw in some whey protein in there to round out the protein target. And they're like, yeah, woohoo, look at me. I'm hitting my goals, eating Pop-Tarts and whey. It's like, damn, okay. That wasn't the intention. And so that's where the whole IIFYM thing came in play and sort of went viral and spread like wildfire. And it was good and bad. It was good in the sense that it absolved many foods of their villain status, just like, certain fruits, rice, just some foods that may have been looked at as bad or, not allowed on in certain competitive seasons. And then of course people would kind of get the concept that, well, you really can eat anything and still reach your physique goals. And some of the people who were savvier and smarter about the whole thing kept these, in quotes, discretionary calories down to a low roar, like 10 to 20% of total calories, so they don't degrade the quality of their entire diet, but they are still able to provide kind of a respite or a break from these Spartan and stereotypical types of bodybuilding prep foods. But then there, of course, were people who ate 80% crap and 20% wholesome foods. And so it's an interesting thing. It was an interesting phenomenon that happened. And it was interesting to be one of the guys who put that acronym out there as a shorthand, impatient answer to newbies asking constant questions, and see it become an international type of viral brand, if you will, of a specific diet where you eat junk foods and brag about it. And the implications of that health-wise are, they're worth discussing. And also the physique implications as well, because you can't necessarily eat exactly whatever junk foods you want and maintain a degree of satiety that enables you to sustain a diet indefinitely. For my research review, I do this monthly research review, which is the first in the industry. I've been doing it since 2008. And I interviewed a gentleman named Anthony Howard Crow, who took the IIFYM experiment to its extreme. So for 100 days, all he consumed was literally whey protein powder of different flavors and Ben and Jerry's ice cream of just various flavors and a little bit of whiskey. And he had these very reasonable calorie and macronutrient targets, but they were hit with kind of this very extreme diet of whey protein and ice cream. And he felt like total crap throughout the 100 days. He performed like total crap. And, frankly, his physique didn't make very good improvements at all. Even though the macros were being hit, the calories were being hit, the training was being done, there was just something about the ice cream and whey diet that just made him feel terrible on a like minute by minute basis, to the point where it just impacted his training and his quality of life. And he was just super glad to be done with the 100-day experiment by the time he was done with it. So when you take the IIFYM concept to its extremes, you'll definitely run into problems. But when you do it in a sensible way, for example, when 80 to 90% of your diet is from wholesome choices, and then you allot 10 to 20% for sort of the YOLO type of foods, whether it be desserts or drinks or, deep fried, Lord knows what's, then that's a smarter way to go about the whole IIFYM thing. And circling back to the question you asked about how does that relate to flexible dieting stuff. Um, Flexible dieting has a bunch of different definitions that it was given in popular culture, but the original definition of flexible dieting in the scientific literature was a flexibility to the dietary approach and a flexibility of the perception of foods. So, in other words, foods evil. And dieting was not supposed to be viewed as an all or nothing type of endeavor. And so the idea of counting macros and filling them in with certain things and hitting your gram targets down to the last detail by the end of the day, that was sort of a later incarnation of the so-called flexible dieting thing that people kind of conflated with the original concept of flexible dieting, which is pretty far from micromanaging your diet. So flexible dieting is technically, it's a cognitive style of dietary restraint. So and it's also called dietary control. So you can either have flexible dietary control, where it's not an all or nothing thing and you don't look at foods as good or bad. And you don't have this dichotomous thinking towards foods. Or you can, on the rigid side of rigid dietary control, it is all or nothing. And there are good and evil foods. And you do have to kind of micromanage and quantify everything. So yeah, there's a lot of confusion actually about what flexible dieting is. But if you can think of it as flexibility of the approach to dieting, then you get it. See, some people have a preference towards and have greater success with more rigid types of approaches and more quantitative and granular and micromanaging types of approaches, whereas other folks have greater success with qualitative, habit-based types of approaches to dieting. And that's all under the umbrella of flexible dieting, which basically says everybody is different in what works best for them with respect to not just the dietary approach, but also the diet itself in terms of things like macronutrient breakdown, things like meal frequency through the day or through the week, and even things like how you would allot for hedonic or junk foods. That needs to be individualized as well. So flexible dieting at its heart is just the individualization of dietary variables and the acknowledgement that everybody varies with quite a wide range with respect to dietary approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think like when I think of just like dietary guidelines in general, I think it's good to have information, especially when it comes to like hitting specific micronutrient targets and things like that, and protein recommendations and some of these things that like our bodies are just simply going to struggle without. And having that information obviously is going to be helpful when you're kind of planning out what you're going to eat in the day. But when you get to the point where you have like the dietary guidelines kind of force people into a very specific set of parameters, that's where I think the failure rate gets to the point where like, what are we even doing here? And with the flexible dieting approach, I just wish they would stick with that, because that kind of keeps the door open for the personal preferences that are going to ultimately make whatever system you put in place sustainable for the rest of your life, versus something you can maybe stick to from January till March, and then you fall off the wagon and give up until the beginning of the next year.
Yeah, totally agreed. And issuing universal dietary guidelines has always been a problem at the public health level. And it's always been, a failure at the public health level. And a lot of folks will point to the fact that, well, the public just doesn't follow the guidelines. And while that's true, it's still a problem.
It's like, why don't they follow the guidelines? If it's the silver bullet, you'd think they would, wouldn't you? Yeah.
It's still a problem. If you can't follow it, then, and if you can't grasp it, then it's still a problem, because the health professionals aren't aren't conveying it properly, or they are conveying it properly, but people just don't necessarily get it or can't necessarily sustain it. So yeah, that is definitely an ongoing problem.
Yeah, and I think like, and then you do have to ask too. Like, I think like when you get to the point where you start looking at food as, like you said, not good or bad, but these are tools I can use. A certain point, you have to get around to picking which tools are going to work best for you. Because it's like if you try to use all of them, and this is where I think sometimes like the everything in moderation gets taken to its logical conclusion as well. And then it's like, well, if you have so much of everything, even a moderate amount of it's going to pile up and exceed your needs, and then you find yourself in the same situation as you did when you maybe were just eating kind of haphazardly. So with like what I think I like about the whole flexible diet stuff that you're doing, and just kind of what like guys like Lane Norton have started to do once they saw all the like the if it fits your macro thing kind of head towards that logical conclusion, is you still, I think most well-programmed dietary approaches have some sort of like built-in restriction if they're going to be successful, because most people just have a food environment around them that otherwise would be conducive to caving into cravings and things like that. So like I think people need freedom to pick that restriction, though, the one that works for them. So whether that is like, well, I'm going to look at what I need from an energy standpoint and make sure I stay within this range. And then the foods I put in there, I'm going to be reasonable about. I think what Lane says, like, you just don't be an asshole. so don't do the 12 Pop Tarts and 3 scoops of whey type of a situation. So like, yeah, you can pick what you want from these groups, but like be smart about it. Like, don't do like, when you know, if you're going and buying 3 donuts every day and just putting a scoop of protein in a shaker, like that's probably not the path forward on a regular basis. So I think he's like leaning a little bit into just like, like use your head a little bit here with this, and don't try to adjust it so far that it doesn't work for you anymore. And then you have other folks who it's just like, for whatever reason, maybe they crave salty, savory foods or something like that, and they get more satiated from that sort of stuff, and they find themselves doing quite well restricting carbohydrate. Or someone else is like gets really full by eating oatmeal and potatoes, so they tend to skew a little further towards carbohydrates. And as long as they're kind of putting that into the whatever plan they are, they have a little bit easier time, maybe, is what I'm saying, like kind of eventually getting to the point where they can intuitively eat without having to like, open up the tracker and weigh all their food every day and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it, Zach. That folks vary in their, I guess, their optimal personalized approach to hedonic allotment. So like junk foods, for example, desserts and stuff like that. There's essentially 3 models, 3 ways to approach that. There's either have a little bit every day, or have a banger of it once a week, or just don't have any of it at all. And the don't have any junk food at all model is very rare, and it's unrealistic for the majority of the population. So then we've got the 2 models of have a little bit every day, like 10 to 20% of total typical calories, let's say like 250 to 500 or 200 to 400 calories a day of whatever on earth you want, whether it's like a glass of wine or 2, or whether it's some freaking ice cream and a cookie or something, every day. And or you've got the once a week, in quotes, cheat meal. People hate that word. Or cheat day. My friend Brett Contreras calls it an if it fits your calories day, where you got your calorie target and you just for one day a week, you literally just fill it in with whatever on earth you want, which is kind of a cool approach for some people. And so you just have to figure out the person that you are in terms of how you want to approach discretionary calorie allotment. But as long as as for most people, as long as you keep it within 10 to 20% of total calories net for the week or the day, then having 80 to 90% of your calories coming from the wholesome and minimally refined stuff is going to facilitate long-term health. And it's going to make things sustainable because you have a little bit of an out, and a little bit of indulgence and fun and a chance to fulfill a sense of rebellion from the rules of life.
Yeah.
So So that's kind of how that should be individualized. And that is what flexible dieting is all about. And it does have certain rules. Like there are certain rules that should be imposed in order to keep things under control from a long-term health standpoint and from a sustainability standpoint. And the 80-20 rule seems to have withstood the test of time in terms of just sort of general heuristics, general targets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes so much more sense to me when I start applying that same logic to other areas of life, and you can really kind of see the way like the human psyche kind of behaves just in general. And one of the other things that kind of became apparent to me was when I started coaching, you'd have this scenario where they're picking races oftentimes that are, 4, 5, 6 months out. And when they sign up for that race and decide to like hire a coach and have this, I mean, same thing as a New Year's resolution. You get the gym membership, you have all these ambitions. I'm going to lose this much weight, or I'm going to add this much muscle. I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. And it's super exciting and engaging. And then every week that goes by, that long-term target just loses a bit of that luster to the point where like sometimes you don't even get to it. Or you get to it and you're just like no longer even half as interested in it as you were when you first started it. So I started thinking about this. Well, what do you do to kind of keep that sort of energy and that dedication, that discipline in place at a high enough level where it becomes a success? And with the training, it was like, well, let's pick that race goal, but then let's look at the scaffolding of what we need to do to get there. And within that scaffolding, there are going to be small goals that we can focus on first and work to, and like breaks in it too. Like, so I'll do like a deload week, usually every third week or something like that. So no one is staring down the barrel of, 20 weeks of progressively getting more difficult. There's a light at the end of the tunnel every couple of weeks or every few weeks. Or they have some small goal to hyper focus on, like short interval development or long interval development, long run development, different things that are going to keep them interested and keep them excited. And then it'll change to something else by the time that interest and that excitement starts to wane. And when you get that right, you start to see like how motivated someone can be to stay the course when they're given those kind of short-term targets that give them kind of a way to like feel like they're not being told what to do, I guess is maybe the best way to say it. Because like if you're that person who's like, I'm 100% compliant, you have to be ready to feel like you're being told what to do by your food or by your workout. And that, like you said, I don't think that matches well with a lot of people's psychology.
Yep. Yeah. And for most people, it is a long-term game that we're talking about, especially the general public. We're talking about health. We're talking about maintaining healthy body composition. And a lot of people struggle with just binging and restricting. And a lot of the basis of binging and restricting is this perception that certain foods are never allowed in any amount. And it's ironic because when you look at the longest living populations in the world, the countries with the longest life expectancy in the world, you look at their diets and you see this incredible diversity of foods. And something that recently struck me when I looked this up, I looked at the Swiss, and they're at number 5. Look at what they eat, and you see a bunch of pastries and cheeses, and it's like that's very interesting. And of course, you've got a bunch of Asian countries in there, and they're eating a hell of a lot of rice and noodles and stuff. And it's not necessarily this what you would think would be the diets of people with the longest life expectancy. And so that kind of tells us a couple things, that there are many other variables aside from diet that determine life expectancy. There are many other high impact variables like psychological health, social health, family ties, relationships, stress levels, activity levels, ongoing body composition, and stuff like that can really kind of dominate the influence to the point that a very wide variety of food selection is perfectly legit for maximizing lifespan and health span. And so I think that we need to be a lot less dogmatic about what we think is the holy grail set of foods that would determine the longest, healthiest lives.
hmm Yeah, that seems to be a never-ending argument that will probably never be solved. So yeah, I
Yeah,
think
difficult to study. You can't set up an RCT for that,
right.
right?
Yeah, and then like, even if we get close with what we have, it's like there's always going to be enough opportunity to push back on it, where then people who want to believe what they want to believe are still going to continue to believe that what they were
Mm-hmm.
before, and
Sure.
I just don't think it's like it's not conducive to properly educating people, probably, to go down that path of like, here's the list of 15 foods that if you
Mm.
eat mostly or all of these all the time, like you'll live to be 120 or whatever the magic number
Mm-hmm.
happens to be. It seems to always get longer. Like every time I look, someone's going to try to live to be 150 with this, that, and the other thing.
Yeah.
It's like, we'll see. It'll
Yeah.
be the what was that? Was that French lady who lived to be like 121 or something like that, and she'd have a glass
Yeah.
of wine and a cigarette every day or something like that.
Right. Some chocolate.
Yeah.
Like, what's the secret? What's your secret, Saul?
Yeah.
Chocolate and young men.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, so it gets really interesting, I think, at that. One thing I did want to ask you about, because the interesting thing to me is, like, if we go back to your friend, I think you said Anthony, who did the ice cream whey protein and a shot of
So
whiskey
whey and Ben and Jerry's diet. Yeah.
Yeah. So when he was like doing that, do you suspect that when he started feeling miserable with it, was that like miserable state impacting his like energy output, because he was like not getting to the gym and training the way he would have been able to when he had like a more well-rounded diet, and then maybe didn't hit his like his lean mass like body composition goals because of that, because it was almost a different framework with his kind of like suboptimal energy levels? Or
Mm-hmm.
because it's interesting, because like in a short term you would think like something like that, or if there was a guy who did like essentially candy and protein and a multivitamin or something like that and lost weight. So it's like, if we with this one like narrow target, it seems like you can kind of eat whatever you want as long as you have that calorie deficit. But like what was kind of illustrated with the 100-day Ben and Jerry's whey diet, and what I would imagine the candy diet was going to eventually get to if it was done long enough, is this like unsustainability. But is there more to it like than that? Is there something going on where I know there's a little bit of wiggle room with just metabolic rate, based on like, if you're just really tired and lethargic, you're going to likely do a lot less like non-intended movements and things like that. So is there any
Yeah.
reason that he was like,
Yeah.
that he compromised that too? Or
Yeah. I think everything got really screwed up. His digestion was really bad. So a lot of diarrhea, a lot of loose stools. And with that, you can kind of surmise that there was a lot of malabsorption going on. It's possible that that particular diet of just ice cream and whey protein and a little bit of whiskey was not optimal for his gut microbiota. And so there was very compromised energy and nutrient transformation going on, to the point where, yeah, maybe he was actually consuming, let's say 120, 150 grams of protein, but he wasn't necessarily absorbing and utilizing it, and it wasn't necessarily getting properly partitioned towards the lean tissue as it should have. And so, along with digestive issues and just having to get on the pot and have the runs, was disturbed sleep. So lower sleep quality ends up sapping energy that could have been used for properly training. And so the cycle was just kind of vicious and sort of fed itself for 100 days. And yeah, he lost a bunch of weight, but he also lost a bunch of lean mass, and he felt like total dog shit the whole time. And so, yeah, it was an interesting experiment, interesting observation of kind of the bad things that can happen when you take if it fits your macros literally and fill it in with whatever.
Yeah. No, I was just curious. When you said that story, I had recalled I had a buddy in college when we were all on the cross country team, and our first like couple of years we would just eat at the cafeteria, which gave us access to basically whatever we wanted. And then you move out of the dorms and you end up somewhere else and you're not at the cafeteria anymore. And he would just go to the grocery store and buy like 30 boxes of pasta noodles, like 30 jars of sauce, and like 30 things of mac and cheese. And I think he probably had a couple more things in there, but it was like 4 or 5 things, and he'd just get in like bulk package basically. And just, he was the type of person who could like, he's kind of mechanical like that, where it was just like, okay, here's the input, just do it and then move on to the next thing. And yeah, I think he just ended up getting shamed out of doing it eventually. but I always wonder like how long he would have been able to sustain that lifestyle
Yeah.
had he, maybe that one was a little more digestively friendly than the Ben and Jerry's whey scenario,
Mhm.
but he
Yeah.
I suspect that wouldn't have been something he would have stuck to regardless of our commentary about it, even if it
Sure.
had been left alone. But yeah, it's interesting stuff. So one thing I wanted to talk about a bit too is just kind of the protein side of the
Mm.
equation.
Yeah.
And with the flexible diet stuff, is that typically the starting point is kind of like, let's first kind of get this relatively fixed number that you're going to want to
Mhm.
hit fairly consistently from one day to the next established. And then from there, we can layer in the carbs and fats based on whatever the energy output's going to be for the day, or however you kind of break up your range of tracking by.
Yeah. The beginning of programming is what is your energy requirement? Um, and let me know if you can hear me or if I cut in or out.
Oh, you're good for now.
Okay. Yeah, the beginning of it is just figuring out energy requirements. That's kind of the one of the less negotiable programming elements as far as people's goals go, and the other least negotiable is protein intake, especially the lower end. There is a substantial amount of research evidence showing that roughly double the RDA is kind of the sweet spot for most goals, whether the goals have to do with health or performance or body composition. It really kind of comes down to about double the RDA, which is 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, or 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. And the way that we program is, or the way that people should program is based on target body weight instead of current body weight, unless your current body weight is your target body weight. So that's the deal with protein. We've got this range that my colleagues and I came up with, and that has rung true for most of the literature, of a lower end of 1.6 and a higher end of 2.2 grams per pound of body weight, or per kilogram of body weight. 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And imperial terms, that would be 0.7 to 1.0 grams per pound of body weight. And that's kind of the magic range of protein intake that would cover the needs of folks with various athletic goals and various physique related goals. There are targets above and below those that are a little bit more on the fringe, but that range would cover most people. And that range would be pretty static, that the protein part would be pretty static, while carbohydrate and fat, proportion wise, it is really just based on personal preference, tolerance, athletic goals, really what the individual can sustain. And there's negligible difference in terms of effects on health, and even to a large degree effects on just recreational athletic performance, whether you go high carb, low fat, low carb, high fat. So it really should be a personal preference thing, and sometimes that can vacillate through the course of a week. You can be low fat, high carb on some days, and high carb and high fat, low carb on other days, and that's perfectly fine. The carb and fat proportion of the diet is the most negotiable programming element, even day to day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that you kind of at the end there when you said like you have that kind of week-long outlook, because I was thinking about this not too long ago, where it's like, when did we decide that like the reset was like 24 hours, where like, okay, this is what I did that day, and then that's kind of like fixed in stone. I got to kind of readdress this again the following day. And when I kind of started getting curious about it was just with my own training, because my lifestyle varies quite a bit from one day to the next, even when I am doing like a similar amount of training volume, because I could be doing like short intervals one day and then just real easy running. So like, barely cracking my aerobic threshold one day and like jacking my heart rate up above 180 the other day. And it's like the needs for those two activity levels are different. So like for me, I was thinking, well, why can't I take some of the carbohydrate I would normally have if I were just to even it out over the course of a week and borrow some from the low intensity day and add it to the high intensity day. So I have like a little more carbohydrate fuel kind of stacked around that higher intensity session. And then on the day where I'm just going to go out and kind of basically recover and move my legs a little bit, promote myself to burn more fat and therefore not necessarily have to kind of consume as much carbohydrate. And that got me down the path of thinking like, well, I should look at this in like a 2 to 3 day window and just kind of position my intake around that versus this arbitrary, like I got to hit these specific things every 24 hours.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. People have this tendency to, well, at least in my circles, take physique related protein guidelines and sort of superimpose them on every nutrient. So for example, protein, you wouldn't want to look at your protein targets as something that would need to be hit on a 48-hour basis. You would want to look at protein intake on a 24-hour cycle, because just based on research looking at muscle protein synthesis and frequency across the span of a day, there are differences in the ability to maximize muscle protein synthesis with, let's say, 2 big meals versus 4 smaller meals. The 4 smaller meals has the edge as far as that goes. And so you can only imagine if you just hit your total protein needs for every 48-hour mark, then there would be substantial differences in muscle protein synthesis within those time blocks if you were to compare that model with something a bit more idealized. And that's just not the case with carbohydrate and fat as far as we know, just because the goal of muscle protein synthesis is not necessarily impacted independently by carbohydrate and fat. And so that leaves a lot more negotiability with respect to distribution of these nutrients over longer time periods, training. And I've certainly seen that play out observationally in the field and with clients and various athletes.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this episode's sponsors include LMNT's electrolyte supplement and Optimal Carnivore's organ meat supplement. If you'd like to see more details and discounts for those two sponsors, head to the show notes or zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. Yeah, so that makes sense. I mean, it was always described to me as if like when we're looking at like a 24-hour time frame or something around there, that like the big step forward is to get enough protein, and then there's another small step forward to take advantage of by parceling it out in like say 3 or 4 feeding sessions versus just all at once like you described. Is that pretty accurate from what you've seen in the research?
Yeah, for sure. And it's very goal specific. So there is this interesting phenomenon where if the goal is to maximize muscle growth, that has a very specifically different set of rules than the goal of retaining muscle in dieting or hypocaloric conditions. So the body appears to be just very resilient and very, very flexible and very capable of hanging on to lean tissue despite long periods of a neglect for protein feeding frequency or feeding frequency period. Some of the more extreme examples of that are 0 calorie every other day dieting, where you see a retention of lean mass over a period of weeks or months. Now, if you were to flip that and make the goal to maximize rates of muscle gain, just try to gain as much muscle as possible in the shortest amount of time, well, that is not necessarily going to be achieved unless you optimize protein feedings per day. And that would come down to several protein feedings in the course of a 24-hour period and ongoing. And so the body takes a little bit more nudging and a little bit more special tactics to grow muscle versus retain muscle in suboptimal conditions. And so the goal of muscle growth, the way that we approach that question is sort of from the top down, where we look at what total daily amount of protein maximizes muscle growth. And then we work down from there. So that range, which I mentioned, is 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. That would be sort of the magic range that maximizes muscle growth. And then we looked at the research looking at acute effects on muscle protein synthesis of various protein dosings, and looking at the higher outliers and looking at the protocols that were more relevant than the older stuff. We came to the conclusion that it's roughly 0.4 all the way up to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. That would be the protein dose that maximizes muscle protein synthesis in the short term per meal. So 0.4 to 0.6. And so just sort of doing the simple math about how many of those feedings equals 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day comes down to 4 protein feedings of 0.4 to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And so that is kind of the pragmatic heuristic of protein distribution to maximize muscle growth. For at least 4 meals dosed at 0.4 to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And that would be taken at least 4 times in the day. And then you'd hit 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight in total. So that's for muscle growth. As far as hanging on to muscle while you're dieting, it's almost like the wild, wild west. Anything goes. If you want to eat 1 meal a day, it'll work. If you want to eat 2 meals a day, it'll work. If you want to eat every other freaking day, it could tend to work. I have my doubts about how well the every other day model would work with the leaner that you get. There's a bit, more of an escalating threat to lean mass retention. But yeah, a lot more flexibility if you don't have the goal of maximizing muscle gain and you just mainly have the goal of hanging on to muscle while dieting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The interesting thing about that, or I guess the follow-up question I would have, if someone was like following a 1 meal a day program and they decided, hey, I want to gain some muscle and I want to maximize this approach, but I want to stay as close to 1 meal a day as I can. Are they going to be okay introducing just like essentially pure protein sources for those other 3 feeding windows and spreading that out? Or is there some application with a carbohydrate or fat along with it that's going to make that more impactful from a protein muscle synthesis standpoint, assuming they're hitting the right macro, or I'm sorry, the right energy intake numbers?
Mm-hmm. 10, 20 years ago, we would say that, combine protein and carbs in order to maximize muscle protein synthesis per dose. But over the past decade or so, apparently protein does the job on its own if the doses are high enough. So there have been a series of experiments comparing protein by itself versus protein with a substantial amount of highly insulinemic, highly glycemic carbohydrate. And as long as the protein dose is about 25-ish grams or more, then no amount of additional carbohydrate increases the muscle protein synthesis response when it's co-ingested with the protein. So this is a relatively recent finding or so within the last decade or so, that we found that protein can do the job on its own if the doses are high enough. Now, if we were to kind of nitpick at the theoretics of somebody trying to stay as close to 1 meal a day as possible, but still try to achieve muscle growth, or still try to push towards the max of rate of muscle growth, then we can speculate that if the person uses a mix of protein types, fast proteins and slow proteins, and not necessarily just a fast protein like whey, then there could be some, at least theoretically, some more opportunity to extend anabolism around the clock, instead of leaving all of the fast stuff to go towards, let's say, oxidation. And so we might be able to kind of twist the metabolic fate of certain proteins a little bit more towards more optimal partitioning, instead of just using one type of protein, like a fast protein like whey. So that is hypothetical and theoretical, and hasn't been looked at. What is the optimal mix of proteins for one meal a day in order to maximize muscle anabolism? That would be a fun experiment to do, but it's never been looked at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that conversation I think has come up in like kind of the carnivore diet community from time to time, where you just tend to get more people who are like going to do a 1 meal or a 2 meal a day type of a structure. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I want to say their argument was the transit time of something like an animal-based protein is going to be slow enough that, like, in theory, you could hit multiple windows perhaps, because it's just going to move through slower versus something that's a little quicker acting. But I think you sort of answered that question already by saying, like, maybe, but it's also all speculation at this point.
Right. It would be a fun experiment to do. Just an all whey diet versus an all beef diet.
Yeah.
Who gains more muscle over the course of like 8 to 12 weeks?
Yeah.
That would be really fun, but I guess nobody's interested in funding that one.
No, not yet. Anyway, we'll see. The carnivores are an ambitious group, so who knows what we'll see from them.
Man, that would be super interesting. That would be super interesting to see.
Awesome. So yeah, protein, I think we touched on all the questions I had around that for the most part. I wanted to ask you a bit about fiber too. When I first earlier in my life, like when I was thinking a lot more simplistically about food, I just assumed fiber was kind of something that sort of came around for the ride when you ate certain fruits and vegetables for the most part. Yeah. And then it sort of served as a potential bulking agent for people who wanted to reduce calories without having their stomach feel like it was empty all the time. Mm-hmm. Since then, I've learned that there's perhaps other applications for fiber, but we want to just talk to us a little bit about like where you see fiber fitting in flexible diet. Is it something that you say everyone should be targeting a certain amount of, or is that a little more individual as well?
Fiber is a kind of an enigmatic, enigmatic topic, because it's always difficult to study health outcomes. And so it's difficult to study health outcomes because you have to monitor people for years, sometimes decades. And then you end up being at the mercy of observational research designs, which are important, but they're also subject to a lot of validity threats and confounders and caveats. And so as far as what we know about fiber, and as far as what the major position stands, at least the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics says anyway, not like they've been super damn right about everything their whole lives, but their position on fiber is to consume 14 grams for every 1,000 calories that you consume. So it's not this staggering amount of fiber that they've concluded is necessary to optimize health, but it happens to be there, so typical person on a 2,000-ish calorie diet would want to shoot for about 30 grams of fiber. I think it would be interesting to try to rank fiber intake on a list of things that impact lifespan and health span. And I almost see fiber as kind of this bystander, almost a default of eating a variety of foods and including plant foods in the diet. I don't necessarily believe that somebody who only hits, let's say, 15 grams of fiber on average in their day is going to live substantially less long as somebody hitting 30 grams of fiber a day. I think there's just so many other variables in programming and within the lifestyle that render fiber as not trivial, but not as something that people tend to put on this pedestal. Like you mentioned that fiber is a good tool for satiety. Fiber is a good tool for potentially, improving digestion. There's a certain amount of research showing that fiber creates a favorable gut microbiota. Okay, cool, and everything cool. I just think that what people have a tendency to do with fiber is think that more is better. And I think it's important to realize that even with fiber, more is not necessarily better. And kind of pushing far past this sort of consensus guideline of 14 grams per 1,000 calories is not necessarily going to be doing anybody any particular favors. Yeah, I think there's a lot of gray area with fiber. I'm not necessarily this person who has a raging, a raging love for fiber, and I don't necessarily see a high fiber intake as essential for maximizing lifespan and health span. I do think it is kind of a passenger and a bystander and a default of eating certain foods that happen to have other constituents in it that positively impact health and positively fill in micronutrient gaps. My stance on fiber is it's fine, but it's not some sort of super make or break.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to see it like, I tend to get entertained by it more than anything now, because you see the arguments about it are kind of funny, because it's like, one side of the spectrum is like says like, well, it's just empty, it's a waste, it's just like sending bulk through your system, and like, the fear mongering might go as far as like it's ripping apart your intestines and all that stuff, which I mean, I don't know, maybe like at certain amounts it could, because you do see some pretty high fiber numbers sometimes when people get to the other side of the spectrum and start looking at it as this kind of like holy grail thing that you should have tons of. But for me personally, I've always just found that like when I'm eating just like my normal low carb diet, which includes plenty of animal products, but also some plants and fruits and things too, like I end up hitting around like 20 to 30 grams of fiber pretty easily in the course of the day without really trying. And my digestion is perfectly fine with that. It's when I start getting kind of, when I try to intentionally restrict it or add more is where I start noticing more issues typically. And they would make sense probably. Like you start getting really high with it, and it's, you're just going to the bathroom all the time. And if you're really low on it, it just kind of makes digestion a little less predictable, maybe is the way to say it. But so I find it kind of just more of an interesting kind of sideline topic that I don't mind watching people argue over, but also,
Zach, it's interesting to see people arguing over the fiber thing, because it's really predictable what tribe is going to deify fiber and what tribe is going to vilify fiber. So you see the carnivore folks, like you mentioned, fear mongering over like any amount of fiber intake. And then you see the vegan crowd just deifying fiber.
100 grams a day.
Dude, it gets crazy, man. And if you look up the consensus on healthy bowel movements, this is another thing that there's a lot of speculation wrapped into it, because frankly, it's kind of hard to study taking a dump healthily.
Yeah.
But anywhere from 3 times a week to 3 times a day is considered the normal healthy range. With a very, very high fiber intake, you see people producing like a kilo of crap a day. If anything else, man, that would just it would ruin your quality of life a bit, unless you just sort of live by yourself and you're okay with having a raw bum all day.
Yeah.
So yeah, the fiber thing is interesting, and I tend to default to the position stand recommending this sort of reasonable, moderate, non-insane amount of fiber intake per day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. Well, Alan, you've been generous with your time. I don't want to tie you up too long this afternoon, but I want to give you an opportunity to either touch on anything you want to say yet, or if you're good with everything we've chatted about so far, share with us where we can find you online and maybe a little bit about your book, your flexible diet book.
Well, I first want to say that it's been a real honor to speak with you and discuss these ideas and stuff. I mean, you've been one of the guys that constantly gets brought up in the debates that I've had over high carb and low carb and all these internet wrestling matches where people are just keyboard warrioring the hell out of each other. You always get brought up, and I think that your accomplishments in athletics are obviously spectacular and commendable. So, I definitely was starstruck when you contacted me to be on the show. As far as my stuff goes, I like you said, I just completed a book called Flexible Dieting, and it's mistitled because it's more than a dieting book. It's just basically it's an all-encompassing nutrition book that focuses on improving athletic performance and body composition. So it's kind of like this biblical reference unit for those goals, and it's written in a non-textbook voice, and I'm really proud of it. It's something that worked on for quite a long time, almost 2 years. But it actually contains like 15 years of field work into the book. And well, more than that. More than 15 years of field work into the book. And that's available everywhere books are sold. And I also have got a monthly research review, like I mentioned earlier, that kind of keeps people on top of the new research as it trickles in and discusses what we can do with these new findings, how we can apply them to ourselves and to clients and folks in the field. And so that's basically my life. It's just research, writing, education, and trying to beat Father Time, trying to beat fate.
Awesome, Alan. It's been a pleasure to have you on. I will link that stuff to the show notes so listeners can go check out your book and find out what you're up to if they want to check out more. But thanks a bunch for taking some time to come on the show.
You got it, dude. Thank you. Right back.
Hey, folks. Thanks for checking out this episode of the podcast. For those of you who are regular listeners, you'll likely know I'm also a professional endurance athlete and coach. If you're looking for a little extra help with your training and programming, I do offer individualized coaching options where you can work directly with me one-on-one. I'll personalize your plan and even scale it up to email collaboration and regular consultations. You can also access either of those on their own if you just want to contact me as you're navigating your fitness journey. I also have some ready-made plans. The ready-made plans follow my coaching philosophy, and they scale from 5 kilometers all the way up to 100 miles and come in 3 different levels. So whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, I've got something for you there. And most recently, I also just added a strength athlete's guide to endurance program, which will help someone who is primarily a strength athlete who wants to either do an endurance event for the fun of it, bolster up their cardiovascular fitness, or just try something out, try something new. So those programs are built to be able to supplement a strength program so you won't have to give up on your gains in the gym while you're going after some running or endurance related fitness goals. You can find all those things on my website at zachbitter.com. Thanks for checking out this episode. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.